Welcome back. This time we're looking at the two endocrine organs that are found in the neck, the thyroid gland and the four small parathyroid glands. The thyroid gland gets its name from its shape. Anytime you see a word with oid at the end, it means shaped like, and thyroid means shaped like a shield. The thyroid gland sits adjacent to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. You might think because they sit next to each other that they have a common name because of a common function or because they're in the same vicinity, but in fact they just both happen to have the same shape. The thyroid gland consists in humans of two very large lobes connected by a narrow bridge called the isthmus. Here in the diagram you can see the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, and then below it you can see the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is composed of follicles. A follicle is a hollow sphere. In the thyroid gland, the sphere is made of a glandular cuboidal epithelium in a single layer surrounding a colloid of thyroid protein called thyroglobulin. As with any endocrine organ, there's a very rich blood supply, and that blood supply not only provides nourishment to the cells of the thyroid gland, it also carries off the endocrine products of the thyroid gland. Here in this photomicrograph, you can see cross-sectional views of the small spherical thyroid follicles, and stained inside of each one is the product of these cells called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin, stored in the hollow interior of each thyroid follicle, is a very special protein product. It's actually the thyroid hormone stored in protein form. You might remember from our first lecture on the endocrine system that the thyroid hormone is derived from amino acids. These amino acids are secreted in the form of a polypeptide, and that polypeptide forms the thyroglobulin protein. So really all it is just linked end-to-end individual molecules of the thyroid hormone. The thyroid hormone is made of the amino acid tyrosine modified by the addition of iodide ions. These are ions of the element iodine. And the thyroid gland is the only place in the body that I know of that uses iodine. The two forms of the active hormone are called T3 and T4, and that just indicates the number of iodide ions found on the tyrosine residues, the tyrosine amino acids. And honestly, for the purposes of this course, we can use the two interchangeably. They do have different levels of activity and slightly different levels of availability in the blood, but for our purposes, they're interchangeable. So T3 and T4. T4 is also known as thyroxine, and collectively these two hormones are called the thyroid hormones. Within the individual cuboidal epithelial cells of a thyroid follicle, the tyrosine amino acid is converted into the thyroid hormone. Here in this figure, you see a cross-sectional view of a capillary, and that capillary is doing two things. It's providing iodide from what you've eaten, absorbed from your digestive tract and carried in the bloodstream, of course throughout the body, but the only place I know of that it's actually used is in the thyroid gland. So here you see iodide in the bloodstream, in the plasma, being transported by an ion pump that notice is sensitive to TSH, our thyroid stimulating hormone, and that then stimulates the uptake of iodide into the cell through a little iodide pump. And then once the iodide is in the thyroid follicle cell, it combines with the tyrosine right at the point where the secretion of the storage form is occurring. Now, in the meantime, of course, we're taking up amino acids, tyrosine, into the blood, and we are forming the thyroid hormone, the amino acid part of the thyroid hormone, into the storage form, which is thyroglobulin. Add the iodide, secrete it into the follicle cavity, and there it sits until you need it. When you need it, by endocytosis, you take the thyroglobulin back from storage into the cell. You break the bonds between the individual tyrosine amino acid residues to give you the active T4 and T3 forms, which then can diffuse into the blood. Now, these are small lipid-soluble molecules, so once they're in the bloodstream, they have to be transported by plasma proteins. You don't need to worry about the name of the transport protein, but notice that albumin can help, and albumin is one of the major plasma proteins. So there you have it, iodine N combined with the amino acid tyrosine, plopped into the follicle as the storage form thyroglobulin, pulled back into the cell by endocytosis, broken into the individual hormone molecules, and then diffusing into the blood where it's picked up by some plasma proteins that will help carry this lipid-soluble substance through the very watery blood. Now, in terms of regulation, you might remember we already studied briefly the role of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, but just as a reminder, the hypothalamus secretes a releasing hormone, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin. And the thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates the uptake of iodide by the cell, therefore the formation of thyroid hormone, and also the secretion of the thyroid hormone. There is a negative feedback mechanism. As the thyroid hormone level in the blood rises, it inhibits the secretion of TRH and TSH, classic negative feedback regulatory mechanism, so that the higher the thyroid hormone, the lower the TRH and TSH, the less the thyroid is stimulated, the less hormone it produces, the less thyroxine there is in the blood, and the more TRH and TSH you will then secrete. So here in this figure you can see that regulatory loop. The hypothalamus secretes TRH, TRH goes to the anterior lobe, the anterior lobe secretes TSH, TSH stimulates the thyroid gland, it secretes T3 and T4, T3 and T4 negatively feed back to TRH to control it. Additionally, you'll see that there are other mechanisms involved in secreting thyroid hormone. One of the ones we know stimulates it is low body temperature. In fact, studies of humans have shown that people, particularly women that work in a cold environment like an air-conditioned office, actually have a higher metabolic rate. They burn more calories even if they're sitting at a desk. Because the thyroid hormone is lipid-soluble, as I said, it has to be carried in the blood. 99% or more of the thyroid hormone is carried bound to plasma proteins, and it's released slowly from these proteins so that you always have a certain amount of thyroid hormone circulating in your blood that's just kind of sitting there in this bound state. Now, the functions of the thyroid hormone are quite diverse, but you might remember we said in our first lecture that thyroid hormone does stimulate protein synthesis in its target cell. It has receptors in the cytoplasm, also on the surface of the mitochondria, and in the nucleus, and actually the receptors for thyroid hormone are found in almost all body cells, and its effect on all body systems is profound. In children, most particularly when the bones are still growing and the nervous system is still developing, a lack of thyroid hormone can cause not only stunted growth but also profound mental retardation. The calorigenic effect. This just means the expenditure or use of calories. So you remember that thyroid hormone binds to receptors on the mitochondria, and it causes just almost like, you could think of it as like wasting ATP, just breaking down ATP without using it for something else. But the result of that is that that release of energy causes the cells to warm up. They release heat in the process, and that heat generation keeps your metabolic processes occurring at normal rates. The effect of thyroid, here's a nice long list, and you just need to trace everything on the list back to you've increased the metabolic rate. So your oxygen consumption goes up, you're using more energy, your body temperature is higher, your heart is working faster, your nervous system's responding more sensitively, respiration increases, red blood cell formation increases, endocrine organs, minerals in bone, muscles, everything just speeds up with normal levels of thyroid hormone. Now, changing topics, there's another hormone secreted by the thyroid gland. It's called calcitonin. And it's secreted by cells that are called parafollicular. Para means beside or nearby. So parafollicular cells sit close to the follicles. We'll look at a picture of them in just a second. Calcitonin gets its name because it regulates calcium. And it regulates it in a specific direction. Calcitonin causes calcium in the blood to be removed from the blood, mostly so that it can go into the bones. So calcitonin is very important in children. I like to think calcitonin is for kids. It helps increase the calcium deposition in bones. It is dependent on blood calcium levels. So in children that don't have a high enough level of calcium in their diet, they're going to see a reduction in calcitonin secretion and less calcium being deposited in the bones. So here in the figure, you can see your thyroid follicles again, but sitting in between them, some cells with a different appearance called the C cell. C cell doesn't stand for calcitonin, it stands for clear cell, but these are the parafollicular cells that secrete calcitonin. Okay, so that was the thyroid gland. Again, the follicular cells secreting thyroid hormone, the C cells or parafollicular cells secreting calcitonin. Now, embedded in the back of your thyroid gland are 4 little clusters of cells called the parathyroid glands. Remember, para means nearby or next to. So the parathyroid glands, all 4 of them, secrete the same hormone, and this hormone is called parathyroid hormone because it's the only hormone secreted by the gland. And the effect of parathyroid hormone is exactly the opposite of calcitonin, which is to say it's an antagonist. Calcitonin takes calcium out of the blood and puts it in the bone. Parathyroid hormone makes your blood calcium level go higher. So parathyroid hormone is actually more important in adults when the main thing you're trying to do is maintain your normal calcium level in the blood. And here in this view, notice we're looking at a posterior view. Embedded in the back of the thyroid gland, you see the little 4 parathyroid glands. People occasionally have to have thyroid surgery, and the surgeons, when they remove the thyroid, have to be careful to leave at least some of the parathyroid glands behind. PTH, and by extension probably calcitonin, has effects on 3 different organs. 1 is the bone, 2 is the kidney, and 3 is the gut. And so as we look at these effects, that's not the way this slide presents them, but here you see the effect on bones. Osteoclasts, remember, break bone down. Osteoblasts build bone up. So if PTH is trying to raise your blood calcium, it's going to take the calcium out of the bone by activating the bone breakdown cells, the osteoclasts. Parathyroid hormones stimulate the kidneys to enhance reabsorption of calcium. They actually bring the calcium level up by reducing the loss of calcium in the urine. And the third effect is to stimulate the secretion of the kidney hormone, calcitriol. And you might remember we talked about this very briefly. Calcitriol is the hormone that's made in the kidneys from vitamin D. So you either eat vitamin D or you make it in your skin, you send it to the liver where it's another step in its process is done, and then from there to the kidneys. Kidney cells finish the formation of calcitriol, and PTH is necessary for that step. Calcitriol is a steroid hormone, and you remember that steroid hormones work by increasing protein synthesis in cells. So when calcitriol gets to its target cells, which again are in bone, kidney, and gut, it increases the ability of those cells to transport calcium. Bone to transport calcium into the blood from the bone, gut to absorb more calcium from the food that you've eaten, and kidney to reabsorb more calcium so that it's not lost in the urine. So calcitriol and PTH work together. They are synergistic hormones. They work together to raise or maintain your normal blood levels of calcium. particularly in postmenopausal women and elderly men, when we're worried about not getting enough calcium into their bone or maintaining enough calcium in the bone, then every time that person secretes PTH, it stimulates the osteoclast to break down the bone a little more, a little more, a little more every time. So for people who are trying to maintain bone density, it's important to get calcium in their diet, preferably at every meal, because once your blood calcium level dips too low, then you secrete PTH. And every time you secrete PTH, you stimulate those osteoclasts a little bit more, and you break down bone a little bit more. So here in this diagram, we just see the feedback loop. The thyroid gland produces calcitonin. It stimulates the kidneys to get rid of extra calcium, but it also, and mainly in children, stimulates the bones to store the calcium. And this only occurs when calcium levels are high, and that's only going to happen if you eat calcium. So kids that aren't getting enough calcium in their diet are not going to secrete enough calcitonin to get that calcium deposition in the bone. Notice the normal blood calcium levels are 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. And in the antagonistic response, if the calcium levels are too low, and this is more common in people who aren't getting enough calcium in the diet, and we worry about it in elderly adults, parathyroid glands secrete PTH. PTH does some good things by having the kidneys hold on to calcium and having the digestive system absorb more calcium, but the calcium released from bone over years can actually remove so much calcium from the bone that the bones literally become soft. They don't have enough calcium in them. So in the table associated with these two glands, there are a couple of things you should pay attention to. First of all, the thyroid gland and its effect on most cells in raising the metabolic rate, but also learn the C cells and the parathyroid cells together. Calcitonin versus PTH, both affecting bone and kidney, having opposite effects on calcium, and in terms of the regulatory control, being regulated by the opposite conditions. Well, that's it for the endocrine glands of the neck. Our next lecture will be on the endocrine glands of the abdomen, and that includes the pancreas and the adrenal glands. See you soon.